Now I want to read one more thing by Tertullian, because I want to put us who are evangelicals to another test, the test of apostolic tradition. Not just of, do we claim that what we teach is true because we can argue it from the scriptures, but is what we teach true because it agrees with apostolic tradition? That was the other test that they had in the 2nd century. And I want to read you something about it and tell you why we should be submitted to that same test. Tertullian says, is it likely that so many churches, and they so great, should have gone astray into one and the same faith? No casualty distributed among many men issues in one and the same result. In other words, let me explain this. The churches of the apostles, they all taught the same doctrine. Like Irenaeus said, they spoke as though they had one mouth across the whole Roman Empire and even into barbarian lands. And Tertullian says, let's look at all these churches. Is it likely that if those churches have gone astray, like the heretics say, that they would all go astray into the exact same error? Wouldn't they go astray into different errors? Wouldn't truth, when it goes astray, go astray in many directions, not just one? There's one path that's the truth, but there's many paths that are errors. How would you get all the apostolic churches to end up in error? Well, you could do that if there was a pope, but we've seen that there was no pope in that day. The pope would be able to go, here's what everybody ought to believe, and would be able to lead people into error. But there was not such a thing. And this is one more argument that there was not such a pope. Because Tertullian says, is it likely that so many churches would go astray into the same error? Obviously, he believed that these churches were independent, not subject to a hierarchy. So the fact is, the early church believed it was a good thing to go to apostolic churches if you wondered what was true. You need to make sure that your doctrine agreed with the church in Antioch, agreed with the church in Philippi, agreed with the church in Rome and Alexandria. It was important that your church's doctrine agreed with those things because they had the teachings of the apostles. Not only that, you could be confident that they really had the teaching of the apostles, because you could not only go to Antioch, you could also go to Philippi and go, oh, they both teach the same things. Even more so, Rome teaches the exact same thing. Even more so, Alexandria teaches the exact same thing. I don't have to wonder if Antioch went astray because they're teaching the same as the other apostolic churches. So it's okay for me to go to Antioch and get truth from them. Now, I think that applies to our day as well. I want to read you the rest of this quote. Error in doctrine in the churches must necessarily have produced various issues. When, however, that which is deposited among many is found to be one and the same, it is not the result of error, but tradition. Okay, I want to point out that if you can go back to the early church writings, and you can find on some important subject that Clement in Rome wrote on it and said one thing, and that Irenaeus in Gaul in modern France said exactly the same thing, that Polycarp in Smyrna said the same thing, that Ignatius in Antioch said the same thing, that Tertullian in Carthage said the same thing, that Cyprian in Carthage said the same thing, that Athenagoras, wherever he wrote from, said the same thing, that Justin Martyr of Rome said the same thing. You have to go, how did they all come to that same conclusion? If it's wrong, how did they all get led into the same error in all these different churches? The fact is they didn't. It was the truth that was handed down from the apostles. We know from history that there were places that bishops of apostolic churches started to go into error, and they were corrected by other apostolic churches because those apostolic churches were careful to maintain unity. They were careful to preserve the tradition of the apostles. One of the arguments that they were able to use with one another is the tradition of the apostles is not to be changed. You need to believe what the apostles taught, not whatever you think you want to believe. So we can argue with you from the scriptures, and we can also argue with you from the tradition of the apostles. And I've shown you that in the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian. I could show you many more references to the tradition of the apostles which was handed down. So if you can find something taught throughout the writings of the 2nd century by people who were leaders in churches from various different apostolic churches, then we today ought to pay attention to that apostolic tradition, just like the heretics were asked to pay attention to apostolic tradition in the 2nd century. It is important for us to be familiar with those things, especially in a day like today where we argue about all sorts of doctrines. There's hardly a doctrine that we evangelicals, born again, sold out for Jesus people, there's hardly a doctrine that we don't argue about. Well, we have apostolic churches that we can refer to. We can look to the writings of the 2nd century church, to people from all sorts of different areas, and see what they said on these matters. And for us to ignore them, I believe, is every bit as bad as for the heretics, the Gnostic heretics, to have ignored those things in the 2nd century. Are we willing to say that we are wiser than the elders that the apostles appointed? Are we willing to say that we understand doctrine better than Polycarp of Smyrna, who John chose to lead the church at Smyrna? Better than Clement of Rome, who Paul and Peter chose to lead the church in Rome? Do we really claim that we know more than them? Or should we pay attention to what it is they say? I can understand if it's just one person. We can go, well, who knows that they didn't go astray? It's possible. But if it's all of them across the board and they're all saying the same thing, we should pay attention to it, especially in matters where we disagree ourselves. We think we understand the scriptures. But I would like to tell you that when you start paying attention to the writings of the 2nd century church, to the apostolic churches and what they said, you will gain an insight into the scriptures that you never had before. Today, for many things that we teach, especially on important doctrines like salvation by faith, the role of works, eternal security, you will find that when we teach, we tend to go, here's the verses that back up what I say, and here's the verses that seem to contradict me, these difficult verses, and then we have to explain those verses away. When you start believing the 2nd century church and the things that they taught across the board, you'll find that you don't need to do that anymore. I found that I don't have to anymore going, oh, and here's the difficult verses that seem to contradict what I said. No, I can teach things and go across the board, all the scriptures fit perfectly into this doctrine because I got those things from the apostolic churches. I examined them against the scriptures, and they make the scriptures more clear than they have ever been to me before that time. They will do the same for you. I'd like to thank you for listening to this teaching. I want to once again invite you to go to our website. I have more on the subject of the early church and the scriptures at www.oldoldstory.org. The website's called The Rest of the Old Story. And our church's website, Rose Creek Village, is at www.rosecreekvillage.com. Thank you for your attention.